guys, and welcome back to IB Psychology. My name is Ben and I'm from EdEquity, and today we're going to be tackling the last part of approaches to research. So let's get into it. So when looking at approaches to research, we must look at the different types of experiments. So let's list them here. So the first type of experiment is the true laboratory experiments, or the true experiment. And the second type of experiment we're going to be looking at is the quasi-experiment. And then the field experiment. And finally, natural experiment. Alright, so let's get into true laboratory experiments first. So true laboratory experiments is laboratory experiments that occurs under artificial conditions. And this type of experiment is often used to establish a cause and effect relationship between the variables, such as the independent and the dependent variable in the study. And in this type of experiment, confounding and extraneous variables, which we learned last class, can be controlled to a larger extent. This means that there won't be much variables that will be interrupting the cause and effect relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. And this type of experiment investigates a construct, which is basically a theoretically defined variable, and it should be operationalized, which we learned last class, which is expressing it in terms of observable behavior. Alright, so now we're going to talk about quasi-experiments, and we're going to compare and contrast between the quasi-experiments and the true laboratory experiments. So, in a true laboratory experiment, let's write quasi versus true first. So, in a true laboratory experiment, the allocation of participants into different conditions is random. This means that the researcher cannot select which type of participants will go to which type of group, and the researcher manipulates the independent variable. The IV for short. And in a quasi-experiment, researcher does not manipulate the variables, the independent variable. And the allocation of groups isn't random, and it is based on their actual traits that set the different type of participants apart. So, allocation, intergroups is not done randomly. But it is based on their traits. It is their traits that set them apart. Alright, so one of an example of a quasi-experiment would be Maguire et al. 2000. This is a good study to remember. And basically in this study, the researcher Maguire and others, et al. Meaning other researchers, studied the changes in the brains of experienced taxi drivers by comparing the brain structure of licensed taxi drivers in London against other participants who are not taxi drivers. So this is an example of a quasi-experiment as stated before, because the allocation into groups is not done randomly, but it is based on their traits, which is because they are separated into taxi drivers and non-taxi drivers. And an MRI scanner was used to see if the fully licensed male taxi drivers with a range of experience correlate with how their brain reacts to taxi driving. Alright. Now let's move on to field experiments. So field experiments are typically conducted in a real-life setting. So this is naturally the participant's natural environment. So if you're trying to see how well a student does in the test, if it's a field experiment, it would have been done in a real-life setting, which means it should be done in a classroom. So conducted in a real-life setting. And in a field experiment, the researcher is able to manipulate the independent variable, but since participants are in their natural settings, many extraneous variables cannot be controlled in this type of experiment. So researcher manipulates the IV or independent variable, and extraneous variables may be hard to control. Alright, now let's move on to our last type of experiment, which is natural experiments. So natural experiments are actually a type of quasi-experiment, so it's a type of quasi-experiments. But it is conducted in the participant's natural environment. Participants' natural environment. And in this study, in this experiment, the researcher has no control over the independent variable, as it is based on the natural setting of the participants. The independent variable must occur naturally. So researcher has no control over IV. Alright, now let's dive into a study and let's try to find out what type of research this study is. So this is Ogden et al. 2005, and it's about Janet. So let's read it together. Janet developed a tumor in her right parietal lobe, detected using a computerized axial tomography that caused a lot of damage. This caused hemi neglect and attention to the opposite side of space. Janet ignored her left side. She blew out the candles of her birthday party only on the right side of the cake. When reading out loud, she tended to omit words from the left side of the page. When asked to fill out numbers on the face of the clock, she wrote only the right half of the clock. So as you guys can see here, only the right half of the clock was written, because it's only written by 1 to 7 p.m. And when asked to fill out numbers on the face of the clock, she only wrote the right half of the clock, as you can see here. She would even ignore parts of her own body on the left side, claiming that her left arm belonged to someone else and had been mistakenly left in her bed. Alright, so in order to tackle the question of what type of research method was used on the study, we must identify the characteristics of this study. So we may notice that this study was more descriptive than typical experiments. So, more descriptive than experiments. And you can observe that it contains qualitative data, not quantitative data. This means that it cannot be an experiment. And also, in this study, the interpretation of the result is mostly subjective and less objective. And also, it focuses on one single case or phenomenon. Alright, so looking at these characteristics, I can identify that this study is an example of a case study. So case studies is a qualitative method and is an in-depth investigation of an individual or a group. And it involves other methods such as observations and interviews, and it is also useful to investigate phenomena that could not be studied otherwise. So this is an example of case studies, and all of these traits are what makes up a case study. Alright, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and listening to my lecture. If you guys wanted to perhaps develop on your understandings on this topic, worksheets will be provided on the website, so please feel free to check those out and start them if you want. And yeah, thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you next time.